Hello, and welcome to the Locked On Leafs podcast, your daily fix for all things Leafs. I'm your host, David Morisuti from Sportsnet, and proud to be joined by a good friend of the show, Nick Alberga. He is the host of the Leafs Morning Take with the Nation Network, a writer for the Leafs Nation and Daily Faceoff, and he also hosts the NHL Fantasy on Ice podcast. Nick, thank you very much for joining us.
Paizan, ¿cómo está? What's up, buddy?
Oh,
How are you?
still planning, man. I'm glad that you know what. Like, there's few people I always, when Mike's not here, I always try to reach out to, and you're like number one on the list. And I'm glad that you were able to join me. It's great to have you here.
I appreciate that. Such an exciting time of year to talk about the Leafs. We get closer and closer to the Stanley Cup playoffs. Got the Matthew Nyes conversation. Got the Avalanche in town. It couldn't be a better time right now.
Oh, it couldn't be. And just like you were, you and Jay Rosehill doing your show 5 days a week, just like we are. It's like I don't call us competition. I call us friends.
Yeah.
In this space, because as I found out, you can never have too much Leafs content. So I always watch your show because I need some of that info you guys put out there. You and Jay have done such a great job since he's joined the show.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we echo those sentiments, and I couldn't agree more. Like, even shout out to the Steve Dangle Podcast Network. I think they're, well, obviously, we go toe to toe sometimes. It's one of those things where it's like there's just so much space out there, and there's people who are going to like you, people who are not going to like you, and I just want to give them an alternative or sort of a different way to go. I mean, so I think it's fantastic.
And you've worked with, this is not the first time you've ever done shows with a former NHLer. You've done it many
Yeah.
times before, but to have one as a former Leaf, as someone who is in the market doing it all the time, like with Jay, how does that kind of help you guys and try to understand everything going on in this crazy world we call Leafland?
It's pretty funny because, like, I think we've gelled from day one when we were put together. I won't I won't lie, I was kind of skeptical. Here's Jay Rosehill, former Toronto Maple Leaf, known for his fighting habits as opposed to actually doing much substantially on the ice. He would laugh at that, but, like, you know what I mean? Like, I didn't know how it was going to work out, man, but I can see why he was really, really liked in the room. Even talking to some guys that he's played with and doing interviews with some guys. We had Luke Shannon a couple months ago. We hope to have him on in the next couple of weeks again. Like, he's just a consummate pro. He gets it. He's one of the boys. It's been so simple and so easy. And to your point, like, I told Jay this when he started. I gave him a call. I said, "Hey, I'm honored, looking forward to working with you. Bottom line, you're the former player. You played in this league. You played at a high level. I can never speak to that. So just speak from the heart and tell us what you know and what you've learned." And pretty much since then, we've taken off here.
Yeah, you guys definitely have. I just want to tell our audience here that if you haven't watched their show, please do go and do that. They actually have their own YouTube page. They always out putting out great content. My favorite one has to be when Jay called out Justin Hall after the Oilers game and pretty much said that, for a guy that, all of a sudden just decided to be physical, he kind of chose a convenient time just before the trade deadline. And I loved it because Jay could do it as a former player because he can kind of see
Yeah.
it from a player's eyes. If we do it, if like I were to do it, people are just like, "Oh, you don't know anything. You've never
Yeah.
played the game." I said, "Well, Jay Rosehill's played the game and he's done exactly what Justin Hall's done." So I always found like stuff like that. Just it's something I crave. I always crave things like that.
Yeah, and you respect it too, right? Like, especially in this day and age of analytics, where you're going to have one piece of the puzzle saying, "Oh, they shouldn't fight at all." You're going to have the other saying they should be more physical, and you need those types of guys to win in the Stanley Cup playoffs. And I mean, you could argue in favor of that, considering some of the pickups they made the last couple weeks, namely Luke Shen, who comes over from the Vancouver Canucks. So I think you're so right. I love his hot takes. He goes on crazy rants sometimes, but I'm like, dude, just let it eat sometimes. Like, throw in a fastball, let it eat, and see what it clocks out at, right?
Yeah, definitely. And what a time too, because the Leafs were the busiest team at the trade deadline. They made so many changes. And when you looked at how this team has responded to those trades, what have you made of the last few weeks since the trade deadline?
It's just really tough because these moves are made for the Stanley Cup playoffs. And I know every time this team loses, the latest being the loss to Buffalo, it's like the sky is falling. It's the same post loss like conversation and rhetoric in this market. I can't stand it. But I think in the long run, it will be beneficial. It will work out. The unfortunate part, again, they're playing Tampa, they're playing Vasilevsky, they're playing Hedman, Kucherov, Point, Stamkos. There's so many gamers on that roster. It's just so unfortunate. And I'm not sitting here making excuses, but I think at the very least, Cal Dubas has put this team in position to be successful, not only for a round against Tampa, but in general, to be successful in the Stanley Cup playoffs. And quite frankly, that's all you can pretty much ask for. The onus is now firmly on the players, right? You
Yeah.
look at that roster. I think it's safe to say if they can't get past the first round, there's going to be substantial trade and change, I should say. And the next card will be a trade, whether Kyle Dubas is here to make that trade or somebody else. That's the next card to play because they've tried everything else. So at the very least, I think they put them in a really, really good position. I really like the pickups. I love the O'Reilly pickup from a matchup point of view. That's going to be massive when you have Matthews, when you have JT, when you have potentially O'Reilly 1, 2, 3 up the middle. That is scary, even for a team like Tampa. And I love some of the vets they brought in. The Charger type guys, I like to call them. Guys like Nola Chari, Luke Shen, I think, is going to play a role certainly moving forward on this team. So you can't help but be optimistic. But having said that, we all know what's transpired like the last 2 decades here, sadly.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part is we kind of know that the regular season doesn't really mean much. And I had so many friends they said, I'm checked out until the playoffs. I'm not going
Yeah.
to really care too much. Then the O'Reilly trade happened. Then it was almost like, okay, maybe my interest has been piqued just a little bit here. But when you look at everything that's come about ever since the trade deadline, the big conversation probably has been around the lineup and how the fact that Sheldon Keefe has continually used an 11-7 lineup. So 11 forwards, 7 defensemen. I get the rationale that Sheldon Keefe is using here when he says he wants to keep guys fresh.
Yeah.
Doesn't want to have too many guys sitting in the press box. When you have 8 defensemen, I kind of understand that. But I listened to your podcast today. Listen to Jay talking about how as a player there's always an adjustment made. Do you feel like that's too much of an adjustment for players to have to make, especially even the coaching staff, or this is the point of the season where you have to try these sort of things?
It's experimentation time, and it has been that way since like mid-December. Personally, I think people are making way too much of this, and it's probably just a byproduct of nothing else to talk about with 15 games or 16 games remaining in the regular season. Yet here we are. Because remember talking about 11-7 like 2 months ago. For starters, Tampa's deployed this type of configuration a lot in
Yeah.
this dynasty run. The Islanders have done it. A lot of teams have done it. Additionally, when you have 9 defensemen on your roster, I guess 8, because Connor Timmins hasn't played since February 24th, you have to find a way to tinker, see what works, what doesn't, look at some pairings. And I think that's exactly what they're seeing. And then my other theory is that maybe they're keeping a position and they know who that 12th forward is going to be. And he's not on this team right now, and he plays at the University of Minnesota. That's just a theory. But I think at this point, they pretty much know what they have in their forwards, even without Ryan O'Reilly in the lineup. And I think it does actually make a lot of sense when you go with 9 defensemen to figure out what you have. Not to mention, again, these games don't mean much outside of the fact that you're still jockeying for playoff positioning. But you have a nice little, pretty decent buffer zone as we have this conversation. Still a game in hand on the Tampa Bay Lightning. So I have no problem with the experimental side of this whole thing, the tinkering, if you will. I know people seem to be up in arms about going 11-7, but right away I tell you Tampa did it. They're like, oh, okay, let's do 11-7.
Yeah, exactly. If you hear that other teams have done it, it doesn't sound too crazy. Especially considering all the new pieces they have put in. Kind of a final one here before we take a short break here. But if you were to look, let's say Sheldon Keefe decides we're going to keep the 11-7 for the playoffs. Who are your 7 defensemen? Because we know the forwards are pretty much locked in right now. Who are the defensemen you would most likely like to see, and maybe who you think Sheldon Keefe, how would that maybe differ from what you think would happen?
So firstly, I will say like the benefits of 11-7, or that you get to see Matthews and Tavares and the big boys more often than when you have 12 forwards. I think obviously come the Stanley Cup playoffs, that's quite ideal if you ask me. To answer your question, I think there are 4 guys right now who I think are staples in those 7 if they go 7. Riley, I mean, it speaks for itself. I know he's been struggling, but still, he's in your game 1 roster. TJ Brody, Jake McCabe. And then I would throw a veteran like Mark Giordano in there, just the intangibles he brings to the table, the experience, the pedigree, and quite frankly, I think he's been pretty damn good this season. So that in lies, I guess, 3 defensemen if you want to go with 7. Justin Hall has something on this team, so he's going to be there. I don't know what it is. I'm not a fan of Justin Hall, but he's going to be there. And then Luke Shen, I think there's like you don't give up a third round pick or whatever it was to get Luke Shen and not play him in the Stanley Cup playoffs, especially against a team he knows very well in Tampa. He won 2 cups with them, so I think he's 6. And then so I said Liljegren, right?
Yes.
So those are 6 guys right there. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. Who am I missing? So Connor Timmins.
And Gustafson.
Yeah, I'm not Eric Gustafson. So Timmins, Gustafson, and then yeah, that's a thing. Like, who would you have? Because I'm not crazy about Gustafson. I think he's pretty one-dimensional. He's not great defensively. He can run a power play, but you have Morgan Riley running the first power play, no?
Yeah, exactly. Like I was at the game in against Buffalo, and I when I watched Gustafson, yeah, I see where the flashes are offensively from him. He
Yeah.
wants to take those chances offensively. But other than that, I don't see how what he can bring to the lineup defensively. And that's been what this team has needed is just the stable back, on the back end. I think that's why Luke Shen, Morgan Riley. I know people have their, as you said, their opinions on Morgan Riley, Mark Giordano, TJ Brody, Jake McCabe. And I think it interchanges with Justin Hall and Timothy Liljegren.
Yeah.
I think those are kind of the guys that will go in and out.
Yeah.
And then yeah, Gustafson and Timmins. Sorry, it's just they're way too low on the totem pole for me.
Yeah.
I do think Eric Gustafson was just brought in as if we lose somebody like a
Yeah.
Morgan Riley, maybe I just wonder if there was always that concern about that knee injury,
Hmm.
flaring up again, and they want to have that veteran steady guy. Although a lot of people wish that Rasmus Sandin was sticking around after that trade, but I think
Yeah.
you have to guard yourself as much as possible. And I think, yeah, that's why I hadn't been in favor of the 11-7, just because I don't know if Eric Gustafson is deserved to remain in the lineup, but at the
Yeah.
same time, he's got to find his way to get his footing here as well.
Well, that's exactly it. Again, to bring it back full circle, like this is a long-term approach. I know people pay good money to go to these games, whether it's against Edmonton or Buffalo, and they want to see a win. These games don't matter. Like I really want this team to have a feel of what they think they have, what they think works, and if that means playing Gustafson 25 minutes a night, 20 minutes a night, go for it. Like really, really figure out what you need, what you think is going to be effective. And then on top of that, you are playing Tampa. So what you think is going to work too. So those are going to be my 7. I think I'm with you on that front. Like Timmins would be out there. Gustafson would be out. And Shen, he's got to be on that roster. Like
Yeah.
I think ideally they're going to go with 6, but I think they really want to see what they have in 7, I guess.
Yeah, I think they're Sheldon Keefe is kind of struggling right now to figure out which are his best 6.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of the top 4 as you mentioned. I think
Yeah.
it's that
The
final
bottom
pairing
3.
there
Yeah.
that he's just trying to figure out. All right, we're gonna take a quick break, and when we come back, I'm gonna ask Nick a little bit more about the goaltending situation because that's been another topic of conversation now with Matt Murray back into the fold. And right now, remaining healthy, knock on wood, we'll see if that remains the same. This is the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. Welcome back to the Locked On Leafs podcast. David Morrissey here, joined by my good friend Nick Alberga. I guess I can call you a good friend. I mean,
Yeah.
we're good friends. We've had even before we were doing this podcast and stuff we were having. We've had a relationship in the past with your work over at Sportsnet. So always happy to have you on. And it's funny because when Matt Murray made his return to the Leafs, the jokes about whether he would even be able to make it through a warm up were nonstop. He's now played, 3 games since he has come back from his injury. In all 3 games, it's been pointed out many times that he's allowed 4 goals or more in that span. I would say it's a little unfair to say that he was the reason why all 4 of those goals have gone in each of those games. But when you look at Matt Murray's coming back, Samsonov apparently hasn't been fully 100%. We don't know exactly what's going on. Sheldon Keefe has always been kind of weird when Sheldon Keefe says that.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe it's just easy for him to say Matt Murray is just going to play. We got to get him up to speed right now. Have you gotten a sense right now of where you think Sheldon Keefe is leaning towards the goaltending there? Or do you think it's way too early to say?
I think it's Matt Murray, man. I just have that sneaky suspicion since day one. They've had the told you so approach, and we put our life on the line, our fate in this guy, and we're going to ride with Matt Murray. He won 2 Stanley Cups 30 years ago, so let's go with him. I just have that feeling, for everything Ilya Samsonov has done, I thought there was purpose to picking up Matt Murray, and that was to be the number one guy when it matters most. And they put a lot of stock clearly in guys who have done it before in the Stanley Cup playoffs. It is a different animal, which with whatever goal he starts, they're going to have that conversation, the pedigree, the resume, the track record in the Stanley Cup playoffs. Again, I think, and it's classic Toronto, this conversation is overplayed, even on our podcast, because quite frankly, I see a very realistic scenario where both goaltenders play a lot in that series, whether it's Samsonov, whether it's Murray, hell, Joe Wall, throw him into the conversation. Like, we're going to see a lot of those guys in general. But I just have to think it's just a gut feel that they're trending towards Matt Murray being the guy. But again, the conversation should be more about who's closing the series anyways.
Yeah, it really should be because I mean, we even saw when Samsonov was in Washington, he didn't start many of their playoff series. It was kind of
Yeah.
him and Vita Vanacek. Like
Yeah.
some teams when they and even Carolina has done that too with their
Yeah.
goaltenders. When you got more than one guy that you're comfortable throwing out there, you're gonna see which one gives you the best chance to win. And I personally just don't know who that is right now. I like some people will say it's Samsonov, but that's just because we've seen more of him.
Yeah.
Matt Murray, since he's come back, I don't think he's lost some games. He hasn't stolen games either in some cases. So I get that, but that's where I'm like you have a month, just over a month left, about a month left in the season. Let both of them kind of show what they can do in different scenarios. They're going to have some very good teams they're going to play. They're going to get a really good sense of the sample size between the two. And health is also another thing that you have to keep in mind here. Who's
Yeah.
the healthier one? Who's the one that's dealing with fewer issues on top of that?
Luckily, they don't have to make a decision for a long period of time. And I really do truly want to see like this roster the way it would look for game one. And that's assuming Ryan O'Reilly's going to be back. Maybe Matthew Nyes is in that conversation, although I don't expect him in the mix if he does sign until like the last couple games of the season. But that's when I think they'll finally make the decision, at least internally. We probably won't find out till right before game one, the day before, or even the day of. But I'm with you on that front. You really can't jump to conclusions. I think if you're the Leafs right now, there's a lot of racetrack ahead. A lot can happen between now and game one against Tampa Bay Lightning. And I quite frankly feel you go with the hot hand at the time or the guy you think gives you the best shot to win, and you throw everything else out the window. But again, I answered your question. I just have that gut feel that it's going to be Matt Murray for game one.
And I should note that just before we started recording, Kyle Dubas at the GM meetings did say they expect Ryan O'Reilly
Yeah.
to be back well before the playoffs start. So I'm going to be actually on the road in Tampa, kind of getting a little bit of a scouting trip
Good.
the week
Yeah.
before. The final week of the season. Brother's bachelor party is in Tampa.
Nice.
Just so coincidentally means that we get to go to a Leaf game in Tampa. So hopefully that means Ryan O'Reilly will be back around that time. You get a good chance to see what Ryan O'Reilly can do against the Tampa Bay Lightning. I feel like that game could mean something depending on how both teams are trending in this final month here.
The funny thing is, I think the Leafs care more about getting home ice than Tampa does, if that makes sense. Because hell, last spring, Tampa proved they can win a series against Toronto in Toronto.
Yeah.
So that's why, like, I think if Tampa was really going after home ice, you would see Vasilevsky play a lot more. I own him in fantasy hockey. I watch a lot of Lightning games. He plays 3, he sits 1. Brian Elliott's not a great backup. He does lose a lot of games. I know he won over the weekend. But I think that's another sidebar story because it's not in this market. But Andre Vasilevsky has been very pedestrian for like the last month and a half, which I think is positive news for Leafs fans. Having said that, this is like the yearly swoon for the Tampa Bay Lightning. They're not really locked in. Hedman hasn't been great. Kucherov's gliding around. Stamkos has been a bit banged up. They're going to find their footing. Like, you have to assume that, considering the body of work over the last 5 years, right, and going to 3 consecutive Stanley Cup Finals. But I think if there's one positive you can grab right now is that Vasilevsky is not playing well, and the Leafs should hang on that for sure.
Yeah, and a veteran team like Tampa, they've played a lot of games, and we saw what happened to them in that final against Colorado. They just had nothing left in the tank, and you gotta have to hope if you're the Leafs that you make this a bit of more of a track meet than a marathon because Tampa, you give them every chance to get back into the series, as we saw. they will do it because Vasilevsky can close out pretty much any series that involves an elimination game.
Well, to me, like, and Dave, that's the big story, and I'm sure you guys will talk about it over the next month. Is like, as somebody again who had the fortunate ability to be the radio host for the Leafs and 590 for a couple of years. Unfortunately, it was during the bubble, but I saw those games against Columbus. I saw those games against the Montreal Canadiens firsthand. And the lasting memory wasn't so much about the goaltending, which we all seem to talk about every Stanley Cup playoffs. It was about the fact Toronto couldn't score that big goal or the offense could never ignite, which is crazy because all we do for 82 regular season games is talk about this insane power play, how incredible these guys are offensively. It just shows you it's a different ball game in the Stanley Cup playoffs. It goes without saying Matthews has to be great. Marner has to be great. JT has to be good. I think the O'Reilly pickup's going to be tremendous. Willie Nylander's been outstanding this season, but come game one of the Stanley Cup playoffs, it's a different animal. And that's why I love these pickups of these depth guys, Lafferty coming in, Achari coming in. Weirdly enough, it's going to be a goal from like a Brandon Hagel or like a Nick Paul type player in this series that's going to win this series, in my opinion. I do forecast it going 7 again. I think these two teams are really, really close. But that's always my lasting take or memory from the Leafs in the postseason for, say, like the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. Really hasn't been the goaltending conversation. It's been more so their inability to score when it matters most.
I agree with that completely. I think the big boys are, when they don't show up in those big moments, and again, that's why the depth was addressed in a certain way because it
Yeah.
kind of helps in that regard. But yeah, you see how different this Leafs team is when Marner's going, when
Mhm.
Matthews is going, and not just when one of them is going, when many of them are going. That game against Edmonton is the exact proof of what this team can do in a 3-minute span when all those guys are going at once. Like, no, not many teams can stop them, and that's been missing in those big moments for sure.
I'm very curious to see how they handle adversity too, right? Like, perfect example, last year, game one, we all forget because they lost the series. What was it, 5-0 in game one?
Yeah.
And myself included, I was like, cakewalk, series over in 4. You had that feel like this was the time for the Leafs, and Tampa comes right back because that's what champions do, right? Like they shelf it, move on to game two. So there's going to be that knockout punch, that big time punch, to quote boxing, in this series. How do the Leafs handle adversity? And that's why you bring in some of these veterans who have been there before. Ryan O'Reilly won a Conn Smythe in 2019. Luke Schenn's won 2 cups. Achari's been in the mix with some really good teams the last couple of years as well. Guys who have been in the thick of things. The Leafs have gained experience the last couple of years. So that's why you bring in these guys to handle adversity and try to bounce back after like a deflating loss or like a tough goal. Because we all know what's happening. It's a long, long series. It happens every series with whatever team in the Stanley Cup playoffs. To me, that's the bigger story from the Leafs perspective. How do they bout and how do they handle the adversity moving forward?
Yeah, that's going to be a very, very good point you brought up there. I think, yeah, all these trades will help, but it's how the big boys respond that's going to really determine how things are going. Well, Nick, I want to thank you for joining me today. This was great. I always love getting people on from different shows. I know Mike's been wanting to get people on, so it was good that you were able to join me with Mike away. I'm sure Mike's going to be kicking himself that he missed this because I know he loves having you on the show.
I appreciate it. You can check out our podcasts over at the Leafs Nation 401, where you can subscribe on YouTube. It's a daily show, 11 to 11:30 a.m. Eastern time, and it's live at the Leafs Nation 401. Thanks so much for having me on. You guys do a kick-ass job, and keep it up. Looking forward to this run, and hopefully this is the year.
Yeah, well, I'll have links to Nick where you can find Nick's content as well, so you can check the description for all that, and make sure you subscribe to their show so you can make sure that you get all their stuff just like you do here at Locked On Leafs. Nick, thanks again.
My pleasure. Take care.